Help give kids an extra life by donating today to help sick and injured children. Link in the description and pinned comment below.
The only purpose AI should have in video games is determining NPC and enemy behavior.
You know, I miss when Konami was good. I mean, when they were really good. I mean, nowadays we mainly know them for crappy business decisions, pachinko machines, and other unsavory stuff behind the scenes. And also Yu-Gi-Oh! But from the 80s to the early 2010s, Konami was a company that gave people reason to be excited, instead of the butt of an infamous hashtag on Twitter. Yes, I'm still calling it Twitter, I don't care what the muskrat says. Back in the day, Konami was harboring so many classics. The classic vampire busting of Castlevania, the stealth action and memes of Metal Gear, the attacking aggressively of Contra, the demonetizing moments of Silent Hill, and of course the focus of today's trip down memory lane, one of the quintessential shmups of the golden age of arcades, Gradius. It may not be quite as well known as some of Konami's other well-known franchises, but it is no less important to the history of gaming. Its intense action and fierce challenge gave many gamers reason to pump their quarters into the machines back in the day, and like Xevious, which I've already covered, Gradius helped influence many shmups that came after it. And I'm here today to tell you how.
Strap in, everybody! We're going full throttle here.
The story goes back to the early 80s with a game designer named Hiroyasu Machiguchi, who joined Konami as a programmer during a period where the company was still transitioning from metal machines to video games. Sort of the opposite of what they would one day be known for. He was assigned to a small team and asked to make a game that would make Konami's name known. He asked, "What kind of game are you looking for?" And the team responded, "We want a shooter." "What, like Xevious?" "No, a game to surpass Xevious." Yeah, like I've mentioned in the past, Xevious was responsible for a resurgence in the space shooter genre, and Konami wanted to beat Namco at their own game. The thing is, the game they were going to develop was originally intended to be a sequel to Konami's previous arcade shooter, Scramble. This was to be the team's first project, and as to be expected, there was some anxiety to be found in the room. I mean, can you blame them? First gig and they were tasked with surpassing a legend. Development took place over the course of a year using Konami's Bubble System arcade board. This gave them more memory to work with, which by extension meant more ideas to experiment with. And that worked well for the kind of visually distinct world with unique locations and enemies that Machiguchi wanted. The game was released in February of 1985, while the international version released on different hardware under the name of Nemesis later that year. So let's pop a quarter in the slot and start this baby up! Ah, love that startup music. So the series chronicles the interdimensional space fighter known as the Vic Viper fighting to protect the planet Gradius from the Bacterian Empire. As the game starts, you're extremely ill-equipped for the task. However, stages are divided between what I call power-up phases and planet phases. In the power-up phases, your main purpose is to gather power-ups by blasting either groups of enemies or differently colored enemies. The power-up system is one of the game's trademarks. Power-ups don't apply right away. Instead, as you collect power-up items, a bar on the bottom of the screen is highlighted, essentially allowing you to choose your power-up by collecting a certain number of items. These range from speed-ups, missiles, and upgraded fire, to drones known as options, which follow your ship and mimic your firing. This power-up style was devised by the team to give the player more freedom with power-ups while putting together a risk-reward system, as opposed to power-ups that had a specific function, which the developers found comparatively unsatisfying. As someone who's played plenty of shmups, I can relate. Imagine building up one weapon several levels only to have it erased because you accidentally picked up another weapon type. That always hurts. Anyways, after a while, the music changes and we transition to a planet phase. Things tend to get trickier in these phases since enemies become more aggressive and tend to use the floors and ceilings to their advantage. Planet phases typically have a mini-boss, which, depending on the boss, must be either destroyed or outlasted, and at the end of each stage, predictably, is a boss fight, which in the first game was typically the Big Core Mark I. In order to defeat it, you must avoid its fire, break its barriers, and finally, as the series popularized, destroy the core. Few things are as satisfying as getting that perfect shot to finish it off. The planetary phases have a bit of variety in their settings, including a couple of volcano planets, a series of space-bound rock formations, an area populated by cannon-equipped moai statues inspired by Xevious and its Nazca lines. Looks like we've gone from Earthbound Immortals to Chronomalies.
It's a Konami game, and I have an opportunity to make a Yu-Gi-Oh joke. Why would I pass that up?
One stage is filled with space clouds that have tentacle arms, which is the last stage in this game where you face off against a big core, while the next stage has you go through a cell-like planet to face a nucleus, before you finally reach the enemy's space fortress to fight a giant brain. And once you destroy the supports on the top and bottom, it explodes for no reason! Yeah, that's a pattern with final bosses in this series. They're kind of a joke. And once you escape the exploding fortress, you begin another loop, only harder. That's not saying the game is easy on the first go-round. On the contrary, it's freaking tough! You're going to want to take advantage of those power-up phases to get the Vic Viper up to snuff, because you're going to need those upgrades. Enemies in the planetary phases use real estate in the air and on the surfaces, and they're quite aggressive. And since, like I said, dying takes you back to square one, you'll want to be powerful and careful to avoid enemy shots, especially if you don't have a shield in front of you, which, by the way, is the question mark on the power-up bar. But while this game is hard, it was quite a ride back in the day. The controls were fluid and responsive, and the game's challenge felt largely fair. Not to mention, the environments looked great for the planetary phases. A nice range of well-designed environments and crisp sprites made it a visual treat. And the music tracks were great to listen to as well. They were upbeat and motivating, making sure your ears were along for the ride as well. The original game was a critical and financial success, being one of the best-earning games of the year and putting Konami on the map. As successful as it was, ports to home platforms were an inevitability. The most well-known port of the game, naturally, was the NES and Famicom port, which was released in 1986. While it was great to see a game like Gradius on the NES, a couple of corners needed to be cut. None of the levels could have vertical scrolling, which was particularly noticeable on the Moai level, and the maximum number of options was decreased from 4 to 2. Still, that was the only major change to the gameplay, which was still highly satisfying. Also, this version was the first game to include a certain code.
Say it with me, everybody! Up, up, down, down, left, right, B-A, start!
This was the birth of the legendary Konami code, which would appear in many, many Konami games since and beyond. It was Kazuhisa Hashimoto, a developer on the port, who found the game really hard during testing, who came up with the code. He added the code to supercharge the ship with nearly all upgrades to aid in testing. It was supposed to be removed prior to publishing, but it was overlooked and ultimately left in because taking it out might have glitched the game more than it was worth. And the rest is history. Another notable port of Gradius was the port for the MSX microcomputer. Like the NES, the MSX version had to deal with limitations. However, it did have additional content, including a brand new exclusive stage and new enemy types. This version of the game would actually branch into its own Nemesis continuity independent of the main arcade series. There was also a port for the PC engine, which was closer to arcade faithful and included an exclusive stage of its own. Granted, the PC engine had lower resolution than the arcade version, but it compensated with some slight vertical scrolling. Okay, now that we've covered Gradius 1, let's take a look at how the series evolved over time. Starting with Gradius 2, Gopher no Yabo, known as Vulcan Venture outside of Japan. The game was released in 1988, but wouldn't see release in America for 20 years as part of a collection. The first big change with this title was that you could select a loadout of power-ups before you begin play. There were 4 different setups, each with its own weapon for each slot. Some of these weapons came from spin-offs as well. Second, the game introduced 2 special types of stages which become commonplace for the series. The first was the boss rush level. You know how boss rushes have become a common thing in gaming? The second was the escape stage, where you had to maneuver your way through a quickly scrolling area of narrow corridors. Gradius 3 would follow in 1989 in Japan and 1991 in America. This added the option to create your own loadout from a variety of weapons, and the arcade version included the series' only pseudo-3D level. It was also known for being brutally difficult, so much that Konami pulled the game shortly after release. The more well-known Super NES port had more reasonable difficulty, and was the only port of the game that had continues. Wait, the arcade version had no continues? Why were there no continues?! In 1997, the first console-exclusive game in the series, Gradius Gaiden, was released for the PlayStation in Japan. In this game, the loadouts were assigned to 4 ships, including the familiar Vic Viper, the Jade Knight, the Falchion Beta, and the Lord British, which first appeared in Salamander, which we'll get to later.
But why name a ship after an Ultima character, huh?
I'm not entirely sure.
This was the first game in the series to include two-player co-op, and on top of that, you could customize the order of the power-up bar to give you more freedom over your power-ups. Now that is awesome. Some even consider this game to be the franchise's equivalent to Symphony of the Night, and considering that game's reputation even today, that's some high praise. In 1999, the series returned to arcades with Gradius 4 Fukatsu, though for a long time it was exclusive to Japan. By this time in history, graphic technology had improved in arcades, allowing for a much better looking game. But while the appearance of the game looked better, there was some shuffling around with the weapon system. Instead of 4 weapon loadouts in an edit mode, there were 2 additional loadouts containing a few new weapons. Also included in this game, there was an online ranking where you could take a password, upload it on Konami's site, and compare it to leaderboards when they were in operation. The game never got a direct port, but it was included in a bundle with the arcade port of Gradius 3 for the PS2. After that, the series would shift to home platforms with Gradius Galaxies for the Game Boy Advance in 2001. While this was simply a standard Gradius title, the Japanese version, which oddly was the last to be released, included an exclusive challenge mode which contained a series of unique stages to be tackled. Later, in 2004, the almighty PlayStation 2 would play host to what some consider the pinnacle of the series, Gradius 5. While the graphics were in stunning 3D, the gameplay remained 2D and was as tight as ever, probably down to it being developed by Treasure, the minds behind such legendary shmups as Radiant Silvergun and Ikaruga. As far as power-ups go, Gradius 5 brought back the weapon edit feature for custom loadouts, which definitely helps. Also new to the game was option control, where you could hold a button to manipulate your options depending on the type. The other interesting aspect in this game is the level design. Up to this point, everything flowed from left to right, but this game included vertically scrolling levels as well to add to the variety. Finally, the last known game in the main series to date is one you sadly can't get anymore. Gradius Rebirth for WiiWare, released in 2008 in Japan and 2009 in other territories, as part of Konami's Rebirth line. This was essentially a remix of the MSX Gradius games, borrowing heavily from those titles. It's a solid game, but unless we get a Rebirth collection from Konami, you'll just have to go by my word here.
Unless you're interested in other options.
Of course, there are at least a few spin-offs of this series. Perhaps the best known is the first of them. In Japan, it was called Salamander, but you might know it as Life Force. Originally, the game was released in 1986 as a spin-off of Gradius. It was one of the first shmups to have two-player co-op, and had both horizontal and vertical shooting stages. However, unlike Gradius, the original release used a standard power-up system as opposed to the power bar in Gradius. This would carry over to the US arcade release after being renamed Life Force and having its setting radically changed. The NES port, however, retained the Gradius-style power-up system, making it feel like a true sequel. And to confuse things even further, an updated Life Force game was released in Japan later in 1988, which had the same power-up bar that the NES port did. Talk about confusing. There was a sequel in 1996 called Salamander 2, which is less confusing. It never got an international release. In 1989, there was a strategy RPG in the Gradius universe called Cosmic Wars, which was only released in Japan on the Famicom. Another spin-off was called Solar Assault, which was a 3D rail shooter in the vein of games like Space Harrier. The game took place in the Gradius universe, which also retained the signature power-up system. There were also mobile spin-offs, including a strategy game for mobile devices, as well as a mobile shooter game. Perhaps the biggest departure, however, was a platformer for the Famicom featuring the Moai statue. There were also plans for a racing game in the style of F-Zero and Wipeout, named after the signature ship of the franchise, Vic Viper, but sadly it was cancelled for unknown reasons. There was also a game for the N64 in the works that was scrapped, as well as a Gradius 6 in development, which was to be released for the PS3 before it too got cancelled.
Guess it was too busy finding out what happens when you press the XXX and the YYY and the XX and the YYY again.
Speaking of Konami being weird, I'm forgetting something, aren't I? Yes, I am. Because there's a point where the spin-offs got straight up bizarre. And so, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, let's talk about the absolute zaniness that is Parodius. This series of games takes the traditional Gradius gameplay, dunks it in a Pyro's fever dream, and has it listen to Looney Tunes music for about 3 hours. Starting in 1998 on the MSX with Parodius, The Octopus Saves the Earth, These games take everything from the playable ships, to the enemies and bosses, to the various stages, and basically does whatever it wants with them, which usually results in levels with no apparent rhyme or reason. Sense? There is none present! The series would span 5 different shooter games from arcades to consoles, as well as a strategy spin-off, each one as bizarre as the last and based in the juices of cartoon logic. So, what's the next logical step from that? Anime girls. In 2007 in Japanese arcades, Konami released the first in another line of Gradius spin-offs called Otomedius. Yeah, Konami decided to play the magical girl card for a couple of games, and let's not beat around the bush. They might as well call this the Cheesecake Factory with these character designs. As for the gameplay, it mostly plays like standard Gradius, with the exception that you only play 3 stages that the player selects. It got a home port in 2008 for the Japanese Xbox 360 called Otomedius Gorgeous, which includes a more familiar arcade mode and DLC, as well as a sequel called Otomedius Excellent in 2011, also on the Xbox 360. The latter being the only one of these games to be released in America. And between you and me, it's little surprise that Konami opted not to continue this route. And unfortunately, that's pretty much all we've seen from the Gradius series, outside of more recent re-releases. And that's a shame, because much like Xevious with a vertically scrolling shooter, the Gradius series was a trailblazer for horizontally scrolling shmups. It helped launch careers and inspired some well-known people in the industry. Several iconic characters and enemies from the series would also go on to make cameos in other Konami games, such as Vic Viper's appearance in Super Bomberman R, and Salamander even received an anime series. While the industry has favored different types of games as time went on, the legacy that the Gradius series has left can still be felt to this day, and any fan of shoot-'em-ups can definitely appreciate that.
And with many series getting revamps, reboots, and continuations in recent years, one might think that this is a good time as any to give the Gradius series another shot. After all, there are still plenty of shmup fans out there, and a new Gradius game would definitely drum up at least some excitement. Honestly though, the biggest obstacle to that is, well, Konami. I'm the Quarter Guy, and until next time, the arcade is closed.
Hey everyone, QG here. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share the video around. Feel free to check out my Twitter and my Twitch streams, and consider supporting me through Patreon, and donating to my Extra Life campaign to support Children's Wisconsin. Thanks for watching.